Hi everybody, for this presentation, I selected the article Transformational Change Governance Interventions for Climate Change Adaptation from a Continuous Change Perspective, and it was published in 2016. The article proposes governance scholars can use principles of organizational communication to create transformational change within the lens of climate change. And this paper poses two main questions. The first being, how can the processes of transformational change to adapt to long-term climate change be conceptualized? And the second question is, to what extent and through which governance interventions can processes of transformational change to adapt to climate change be influenced? So, this study relies on organizational theory, with the authors arguing that although organizational change theory typically focuses on change that's happening in an organization, a lot can be learned for the governance of adaptation to climate change. So, theorists have found three dimensions of change. These are depth, scope, and speed. In change theory, depth refers to the level of change present. So it can be superficial or it could be in depth. And then these can also be described as first and second order changes. First order changes do not attempt to alter a mindset. They just attempt to improve what's already going on. And then second order changes look to reframe a problem. And then actually the authors go beyond these two known change orders and talk about a concept of third order change that was proposed by the scholars Brewer-Tenney and Mock in 1987. And third order change emphasizes the meta level of change and attempts to change the way we change. Okay, and so then the second dimension of change is scope, which just refers to the scale of that which is to be changed. So a broad scope is a large system, narrow scope is individual subsystems. So with regards to climate change, narrow scope could have to do with maybe a family that has decided to start recycling or a person who chooses to become a vegan for climate change purposes. And then the third dimension of change is speed, or just the time frame when change can be achieved. Alrighty, so to answer their research questions, the authors propose small-scale incremental change and large-scale radical transformational change will need to be rejected, and then a third kind of change, a continuous combination of the two, is what would be successful. So this leads to the methodology that this perspective of continuous transformational change focuses on how transformational change can be shaped through a series of small, in-depth steps. The authors also propose that to survive, organizations cannot afford to be stagnant. They must be able and adapting to be constantly changing. So continuous transformational change can't be controlled by planned change efforts. And that actually findings show that more than 80% of all planned change projects do not result in the envisioned transformational change. So the authors suggest three groups of change interventions motivated by the observation that people, organizations, and networks are already changing continuously since they are involved in numerous adjustments of their social practices in response to ongoing environmental dynamics. The first group of interventions they suggest focuses on setting conditions that encourage continuous adjustments resulting in small wins. So in-depth change at a very small scope. The second group aims to increase the chance that these small wins translate into change at a larger scope. And then the third group of interventions only comes into play if the process of change is continuously stopped. And then in these situations, intentional interventions are just needed to unblock that stop and restore the change. So to complete their study and illustrate these three proposed types of intervention, the authors use examples from the Dutch Delta program. So the Dutch government initiated this program in 2012 in response to growing concerns about the destructive effects of climate change. The program aims to guarantee flood protection and safeguard fresh water supply in the Netherlands until 2100. So the program was a deliberate decision to set up a separate program to climate-proof the Netherlands as a bypass of administrative systems and political systems that were already in existence. And then this did fulfill some of the basic conditions of transformational change, like it provided a clear direction of goals. There was a clear focus on connecting people. It contributed to the rise of awareness, and it encouraged people to always stay in motion. However, to amplify this process, the authors present three interrelated intervention strategies aimed at accelerating the change that was already underway. And these strategies are sense-making, coupling, and integrating. So sense-making recognizes patterns of continuous adjustments and makes them more salient. The authors state that in an ideal situation of sense-making, the Delta program would have started with identifying small-scale, in-depth changes that were already going on. Instead, they just installed a new structure and overlooked the informal stakeholder networks that were already connected with climate change. And so the next is coupling, which organizes connections at various levels. So there was coupling that existed within the Delta program, that it just wasn't successful in the sense that sub-program directors acted as liaisons between the regional and national decision-making arenas. However, they faced a huge challenge in negotiating regional interests presented at the national level, as well as presenting national interests at the regional level. And then integrating connects new experiences with adaptive practices to the existing institutions. So the program was launched in 2012. By the end of 2014, the program delivered the Delta decisions, and these formed the start of a new phase of programming that was more focused on implementation. And then this raised the question of what is the best implementation strategy. So for several policymakers, the bypass structure was only of temporary value, and implementation could be best established by integrating the program within the traditional line of organization. And then for other stakeholders, they resisted this default solution, arguing that reducing such a complex problem like climate change to a simple policy plan would not result in the envisioned transformational change. And in the end, no group was satisfied, and they had to end on a compromise. So on to the results and conclusions. The intervention strategies mentioned are only effective if actors are able and willing to reflect and to learn. However, in many situations, people or organizations are not or are no longer able to change their deep structures and core beliefs to new demands. All three groups of interventions proposed by the authors implicate that the attention of governance actors requires a shift to more modest roles of setting conditions. These roles require time and patience, and people need to be able to experiment to see how new things work when done differently, and then share these experiences with others. More so, governance actors who choose planning and control-based strategies often discard adaptive processes and discourage adaptation. And then the author's final reflection on their argument is that much can be learned from organizational change theory with regards to climate change. So the authors do mention several limitations in their to their research. The first being they only reviewed a small part of the extensive literature and relied mainly on authors who explicitly studied how organizations can adapt to dynamic environments. And then the second is that in organizational communication and climate change, adaptation means different things. So in organizational literature, it just means adjusting values, processes, and structures to new kinds of changes within the organization's environment. And then in climate change, it's defined as adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli. The third is just the difference between collective and autonomous adaptations, collective being large groups and autonomous obviously being individuals. And then the fourth limitation is that the authors use theories focused on organizations and argue these can be applied to households, communities, networks, regions, or even whole societies. The Delta program kind of proves this assumption, but further research could elaborate the set into specific governance intervention strategies for climate change, like particularly for the context of like high stakes, conflicting interests, and unequal power positions. So overall, this study contributes to the understanding of organizational change, communication, and leadership because transformational change is such a key idea that reflects a lot of different, from organizational change to climate change. So specific to this study, transformation and transformational change in general is increasingly being discussed as a necessary societal response to manage current and projected climate risks, as many more are realizing every day that climate change is a real issue and are looking to find transformational change that will reverse or put an end to the problem. Thank you.